So he plays d4, and he plays a lot of things on move 1. Knight to f6, and c4, pawn to g6, knight to c3, and here black has a fundamental choice to make. Basically, black can play bishop to g7 and allow e4. That would be the King's Indian defense. Or black can play the move d5 here, which is the Grunfeld defense. Technically, black can play the move c5 here, but it's kind of a poor man's Benoni, since white can play e4 and capture on d5 with an e-pawn. So here, most good players play either d5, the Grunfeld defense, or bishop to g7, the King's Indian defense. Basically, if you want to play the Grunfeld defense, you have to play d5 right now, because white is about to go e4. Right? So Firouzja decides to play the Grunfeld defense, although he has played the King's Indian as well. So the main move in this position is c takes d5, and after knight takes d5, pawn to e4. This is kind of the main way the game goes. And in the Grunfeld defense, black is looking to counterattack white's big center with their pieces. It's a very classic hyper-modern chess opening. But Rapport plays knight f3, which is also common, but not the most common move. And then after bishop to g7, now he takes. And after knight takes, this could easily, after e4, transpose back into the main lines. But Rapport didn't play the move pawn to e4, which is by far the most common move in this position. He played the move bishop to d2. It's not weird, but it's not the main line. Basically, what white wants to do is white wants to play the move pawn to e4. And if black captures on c3, he doesn't want to capture with his pawns, kind of weakening his pawn structure. He wants to capture with the bishop and then potentially challenge this bishop on g7. And this move, bishop to d2, can be played a little earlier. It can be played right here. And this is known as the Makoganov variation. So Firouzja castled. Can't blame him for that. Rook to c1 was played. Firouzja willingly took on c3 with the knight. Didn't wait for the move e4 to come. So he took on c3. Rapport played bishop takes c3, and that was kind of the whole point of putting the bishop on d2. A lot of times in the Grunfeld, black wants to play the move c5, but here, white could just take the pawn on c5. And then this bishop actually makes a lot of sense. So Firouzja was trying to play around that now and played the move knight to d7. And Rapport's like, okay, I need to develop my pieces, so I'm going to play pawn to e3, protecting my center, and then I need to get my bishop out. Okay, so pawn to b6 by Firouzja to get the light-squared bishop into the game, and possibly, of course, prepare the move c5 at the right moment. Bishop to e2, Rapport's catching up in development. I like the placement of the bishop on e2 versus somewhere else, because, you kind of expect this is going to happen, so I like the bishop protecting the knight. But also, sometimes what you do is you move this knight away, and then you challenge this diagonal with your bishop. You can't really do that if you're on another square. So bishop to b7, pawn to b4. So, okay, now there's nothing wrong with castling, but Rapport wants to kind of discourage the move pawn to c5. And after pawn to c5, he would just be able to take that. And black is not winning the pawn back here, because after a trade of pieces, one, you could take this pawn, but I think possibly a greater issue is the move bishop to b5. So Firouzja decides to play knight f6. He's looking to place his knight either on the e4 square or on the d5 square, get his pieces into the center on the light squares. And of course, Rapport castles. I mean, you got to castle. knight to e4, attacking the very important bishop on c3. The bishop retreats back to a1. You don't want to give that bishop away, especially in this open game. And here, Firouzja decided to play the move queen to d6. And he's attacking this pawn on b4. And here, Rapport played a very cool move. So most normal people, and I think I mean normal in a bad way here. I don't mean like Rapport's not normal, okay? Most people would do something directly about this pawn on b4. But Rapport was like, wait a minute. If you take this pawn, right, I get this one. Which one's more important? Maybe the one on c7. Because if I get my rook to the 7th rank, that looks pretty good. Okay? So instead of guarding the pawn by advancing it and clamping down on the queen side or playing something like a3, he says, well, I don't really want to guard that right now. I'll play the move knight to e5. So this is what Rapport played. Very nice move. So he's basically saying, okay, if you take this pawn, I take your pawn on c7, I attack your bishop on b7, and my rook is on the 7th rank. Okay, again, not the end of the world, but white's making a few gains in the position. So Firouzja played rook to c8, and now he said, okay, now don't tempt me. I will take that pawn. Okay, so don't mess with me. I'll take that pawn. And again, a3 is a totally viable move here and probably a good one. Rapport played the move queen to a4. And I totally get that move. I totally get that move. Because here, he's going after a square that if you're a Queen's Gambit player or an English player, this particular square on the chessboard is often very, very, very weak. It's a square you'd love to jump into with your pieces. Okay, Rapport might actually want to do two things, okay? He's eyeballing the c6 square because he's got his knight, queen, and rook there. And if this pawn on c7 cannot advance forward, then white has clear pressure on the c-file against that pawn, positional pressure. It's kind of a backwards pawn in a way. But if you're Richard Rapport, what other move might you want to play here to further weaken the light squares? Exactly. Yeah. Bishop to a6. Yeah. Bishop a6. So Firouzja stopped that. Firouzja played a6 himself to stop that. And of course his idea, is I don't want to allow bishop to a6. Like, just to kind of show you what a disaster, like if you're not paying attention to these ideas, positionally speaking, what type of disaster this could be. So like, let's say you go a6 or h6 and I play, let's say, bishop to a6, something like this. Okay, maybe I shouldn't even do that immediately because this pawn is under attack. I mean, it's probably still okay, but maybe I shouldn't do that immediately. Heck, maybe I should just play the move b5 to clamp down on these light squares. But basically, if I get a position where I get my knight in here, let's say you have to take and I take, right? I mean, I don't know. Let me just try to show you what you shouldn't really ever want to allow, okay? You get a position like this, and not only in this example does white have the two bishops, but like, let's just say we play very standard here, okay? We just double on. Look at black's pieces. All guarding the weakness, the backwards pawn on the c-file. So you cannot allow something like this to happen. So Firouzja is strong enough to understand that, obviously. So he plays a6. And then Richard Rapport just jumped right into that c6 square and said, give me that square. I don't want to allow you to play the move pawn to c5, breaking up the center and getting rid of your weakness. So I'm going to plant my knight right on that c6 square. And Firouzja played b5, which I'm sure he had intended to do the whole time. Queen to c2, guarding the knight. We have massive trades. Okay, and we get this position, right? So what's up with this position now? Well, it's not looking good for black. Okay? Even though material is even, the position is not even. What's in white's favor right now? So Vino says the bishop, the backwards pawn on the c7 square. Yeah, and that is such an easy target, and black does not want to be in a situation where black is stuck guarding that by some passive approach like rook a7 and, like some terribly passive approach, because if that happens, then white is going to be in total control anyway. How does Firouzja net his counterplay? Very good. Weiss says a4 or a5. Yeah, he's got to play a5. Without a doubt, he's got to open up lines for his own rooks. And the best way to defend a bad position is oftentimes with developing counterplay. And that's something like if you were working with Grandmaster Rustemov, he could teach you. But if you only look at the computer evaluation, you may never learn. Going for active counterplay is almost always your best defense in any position, particularly in the endgame. So stronger players would be willing to, let's say, give away a pawn, but have active pieces, even in an endgame where you're approaching, the part of the game where pawns matter. Even in the endgame, people would prefer to keep their pieces active over passively trying to protect a weakness. In the game, here Rapport played the move bishop to d3 and kicked the knight away. The knight went back to f6. Then he took, and then planted the bishop on c4. So again, big trouble for Firouzja here. Big trouble. Because the bishop is not only defending the clear target that black has, which is the pawn on a2, but the bishop remains very active and beautiful on this diagonal. Let's see what happens. Okay, so knight e4. First things first, you can't fall for tricks. Do not fall for tricks. We cannot allow knight to d2. Rook c1 was played, so you're not allowing any shenanigans. Knight to d2. And now, you don't want to go here because you don't want to give away your bishop pair, and also you don't want to allow the rook total freedom, right? You don't want to give away the bishop for the knight, so naturally, bishop to a6 was played. So the rook moves. And now here, Rapport played a series of, it's a mix, like prophylactic moves and position, like protecting the weaknesses while driving black's pieces away. So he just kind of said, okay, you can't really do much right here. So I'm going to play rook on 1 to c2. I'm going to attack your knight. Okay? And if your knight simply goes away, now, okay, I have protection of this square, but I won't probably move anything. I'll just kind of, little by little, I will start to unravel my position. Okay, so Firouzja plays a tactical move. Okay. The rook b6 was played, tactical move by Firouzja. We have a moderate fork here. Okay, so we have an exchange. Okay, it's merely a majority in name or by technicality, but you can't actually produce a passed pawn. So these double b pawns are both kind of being stopped by this a pawn. So bishop to b7. His bishop was in danger, so he grabs a little tempo here, and you can see that he's limiting the knight. Rook to a7, and bishop to c6. So, nice, reasonable placement for the bishop, and we're limiting the knight's squares. Knight to b1. All right, funky square for the knight, but okay, it has a purpose, okay? He wants to play possibly the move knight to c3, and if you take, it's not so simple, right? Very smart move. He plays bishop to d5. Now that the knight isn't protecting that anymore, the bishop it's perfect on this diagonal. The bishop is really well placed on this diagonal because it remains active while guarding the weakness on a2, right? So it's simple but strong. And if knight to c3, which is what happened, there ain't no way I'm doing this. That's not happening. So you're threatening my bishop, but I want to play the move bishop to b3. And now I might take, because that same defensive pin doesn't work. because my bishop is guarding my rook. And so, of course, Firouzja is like, okay, I don't want to just lose. You know, I don't want to just lose a pawn. So now I like what Rapport does here. He feeds 2 birds with 1 scone. He stops Black's pawn break while mobilizing his majority. So what did he do? Many roads lead to Athens here, possibly. Like g4 is a move that I like, but I like the move f4 as well, which is the move Rapport played, because it stops e5. I'm not even sure e5 was a good move, but it definitely stops e5. And you can't utilize this outpost because you're in a pin. And otherwise, Rapport is just going to mobilize his massive pawns over here in the center and on the king side. e6 was played by Firouzja, and Rapport played the move g4. I love this because again, you say I got a 5 on 4, right? And I'm not exactly sure how I'm gonna break through, but I know that I'm playing with 5 pawns and you're only playing with 4 pawns. So I need to take advantage of that. And I like that Rapport's just focusing on keeping his eyes on the prize and focusing on mobilizing the majority. So that's what he does. So bishop to f6 by Firouzja, pawn to g5, and you know there's no pawn breaks for Firouzja, no useful ones. And now he brings the king carefully into the game. So you don't want to go king f2 and possibly allow a trading of pieces, although that might still be okay. He wants to keep the rooks on. King to g7, king to f3. Very careful approach. You can see that Rapport is just clamping down on clamping down on the black position. h6, and he says no, not happening. If you go h5, that's okay. I'll go e4. I will use my 5 on 4, and I will do something with it. Okay? Promise you that. So rook to c8, bishop to b2, just little by little, improving the placement of the pieces. There's no tactical shot here. There's nothing that's going to put anyone out right now. White's got the advantage because of the healthier pawns and the better pieces. Black is very tied down to the c file here. We're going to see what Rapport does. Pawn to b5, rook to c1. Okay, it's fine. We see a maneuvering here. Bishop to d8, that might be a mistake. And now Rapport plays the move, only now Gradiosis, after improving his whole position first and mobilizing the king, mobilizing the majority, he plays the move pawn to a3, chipping away at the protection of the knight. Of course, if you take this, I take this. So that's good. So you kind of have to guard this. So Firouzja played the move bishop to a5. We have a trade here. Now this knight is very limply protected. Okay, if it wasn't for the bishop and it wasn't for the rook, the knight would just hang. You can't move the knight because if you move the knight, then you lose your rook. So the knight is a very fragile piece here. And Rapport just kind of goes, okay, I'm still mobilizing. You can't move. Bishop to a5 was played. And now, finally, we see how the majority comes into play here. Rapport plays the move pawn to d5. And he calculated that this pawn, this passed pawn, is going to be necessary in order to distract Black's pieces away from this knight. One of the reasons why bishop to a5 was played is Firouzja wants to guard the knight with his pawn. He doesn't want to guard the knight with the bishop the whole game. So, but d5 immediately creates a passed pawn, and now we're going to see we're going to see a very complicated game. But I have to point out, there's some issues here. These bishops are really starting to shine now as the position opens up. So we had a little trade here, and now b4. And that was probably necessary. Because if you don't do that, White's just going to roll this pawn down the board. Eventually you're going to be distracted. Either your bishop or your rook is going to be distracted. So eventually you have to play b4. So b4, d6. So beautiful bishops are now opened up. Really putting the heat on Firouzja. Rook to d8, very natural. Rook to d1. Beautiful little move. Not too difficult, but I like that move because, you know, it's cute. But basically, you're putting your rook behind the pawn. You're using the fact that the knight is in the pin, right? And not easy for black to play here at all. You know, the bishop is very passive. The knight is kind of intrusive, but it can't move. So bishop to b6, you know, that's probably good because rook to d4 might have tied him down, or even something like rook to d5, and then, you know, there's all sorts of things. So pawn to d7, pushing the pawn all the way to the 7th rank. And now it's very natural what Firouzja did. He played the king over. He was going to bring the king over. Rook to d6. He has his eyes on another weakness in the position, the f-pawn. Bishop goes back to a7. And now bishop to c4. Okay. So the idea here is if you play the move king e7, there's the move rook f6. And if you take this pawn, the whole king side collapses. And okay, in this particular case, you drop a bishop. Let's say you go here. Okay, so here, something like this, and the whole king side collapses. So a terrible situation. 2 bishops and 2 connected passed pawns is definitely going to win the day for that. So you can't just come over there and think you're going to round up the pawn. So Firouzja played bishop to c5 to get out of my house. Rook c6, keeping the tempo. Bishop to d4. And now rook to c8. And again, very annoying to deal with this. Because if your king is over here, then my bishop's going to mop up your pawns. So here Firouzja blundered. But he's in a very difficult situation. The bishops are very powerful. And this light-squared bishop, unopposed, is ready to eat these fixed pawns up. He played king e7, which seems natural, but that just loses the game. The only move which prolongs the game a little bit, and at least is more tenacious, is the move bishop to b6. And then at least the victory is not clear here, by any stretch. Okay? Having said that, still very difficult for black to play. Because white can guard this pawn with the bishop, and black's pieces are totally tied down. Black is basically cannot move. So there's a simple idea, bishop to b5, for example, you know, guarding this pawn. And I actually think you can get away with it. First of all, bishop to b5 here. If knight takes, there's bishop to f6, which is kind of sick. I mean, that's kind of sick. But Firouzja blundered immediately. He played king to e7, and now Rapport didn't have to try too hard. He traded, or he played bishop takes. There's nothing wrong with this either. This is completely winning as well. So he played the flashier move, bishop takes f7. King takes d7 happened. And this is probably winning. But Firouzja said, well, since you didn't take my rook off the board, how about we keep the rook on, attack these 2 things, and then I still get this. So the game ended very soon. King e7, bishop takes g6, rook to d6, and rook takes b4. And the game ended because after rook takes g6 and rook takes d4, white has 2 connected passed pawns for nothing. And white will win. Hi, I'm Peter Giannatos, founder of the Charlotte Chess Center. If you enjoyed these videos, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you'd like to watch these videos live, be sure to follow us on Twitch.